Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome to the 6th Baxter lecture. If you haven't already signed in or washed your hands, please do so at the end of the lecture so that in the event of us needing to trace anybody, that we've got some traces. There is unfortunately a third and unaccounted for cluster which has just been reported today. So it gives me very great pleasure to welcome a friend, a member of the Baxter Trust, and you may know him as a former Attorney General, Chris Finlayson. Chris's own academic background is Latin and French, which I think is a good basis for any kind of occupation. He also did a law degree at Victoria, and as you know, was Attorney General in the key government. And he was responsible for 59 treaty settlements, so you've set a bit of a record there. He also represented New Zealand at the International Court of Justice, arguing our case against Japanese whaling. He is a liberal conservative. He has a wonderful sense of humor. He's got a great fondness and love of the arts and music. He is a Renaissance man. And I think we are in for a real treat tonight. Chris is going to talk to us for probably about 45-50 minutes on the whole topic of dissent and its place in modern political systems. So without any further ado, I give you Chris Finlayson.
Raurangatira mā tēnei taku mihi atu kia koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa, e nā mate haere, haere, haere atu rā. Thank you very much for inviting me to give this address tonight. I'm conscious that I've got to stand still because the cameraman will get annoyed otherwise. Indeed, I am involved in the arts. Prior to entering into Parliament, I was on the String Quartet Trust. I was chair of the Arts Board of Creative New Zealand, which is the funding, or was the funding wing of the Old Arts Council, and I was on the NZSO Foundation. I was very lucky to have 6 years as Minister of Culture and Heritage, where I got to know Catherine Baxter, who's here tonight, who was number 2 in the ministry and is Archibald Baxter's granddaughter. After I left Parliament, I thought I'd try and knuckle down and concentrate on being a lawyer, but I'm a soft touch. And since then I've become a trustee of the Sargent Art Gallery in Wanganui. I'm the Deputy Chair of Chamber Music New Zealand. I'm on the Adam Foundation, and I'm also a trustee of the Archibald Baxter Memorial Trust. But it's one of those rare situations. The Archibald Baxter Memorial Trust didn't hunt me out. They approached me to see if I'd be happy to support the project, which Kevin will tell you about a little later on. But I was very keen to become a trustee of the Archibald Baxter Memorial Trust because I think it does very important work and I am very, very honoured to be associated with it. So I think that the fact that I was interested in becoming a trustee of the trust was something of a surprise to at least some of the trustees, because it's not every day a former national minister of the Crown offers to join a trust dedicated to the memory of conscientious objectors, but there we are. And I always recall when I wondered, what is it about me that makes me tick? I received a very valuable life lesson many, many years ago. I'm much older than I look. In the mid-70s, a group of, we were then called 7th formers, year 13 students, were invited by a Radio New Zealand journalist, Jessica Waddell, to take part in a program called Youth Viewpoint. And we interviewed, for example, the Attorney General of the day, Dr. Martin Finlay, and we interviewed the former Society for the Protection of Community Standards president, Ms. Bartlett, and we also interviewed one other person whose interview I'll always remember, and that was Dr. Eric Geiringer, who was then a medical practitioner in Kelburn and died many years ago. His daughter, Claudia, is a professor of law at Victoria University. And I remember asking him, well, Dr. Geiringer, are you a liberal or are you a conservative? Are you a socialist or a free marketeer? And he gave me a very valuable life lesson, which was he always tried to avoid labels, because once you're labelled as a conservative or a liberal, any response you give can be pigeonholed. You're pigeonholed into a particular category. And so he tried to avoid being pigeonholed as a liberal or a conservative, although I think he was a liberal. But I think that's actually a very good way of looking at life, and not enough people do it. I don't always do it, but I've always tried to say, for example, I was and am a liberal conservative, because the two traditions are equally valid and not mutually exclusionary, I should say. And so that's me, a person who I hope doesn't fit into a particular pigeonhole, who's tried to look at particular issues to determine whether they're worthy of support. And so I, as a national person, was very pleased to be part of this trust, because it does good work, and because I think that those who opposed the First World War on moral grounds were heroes and heroines whose memory deserves to be revered. I always worry when I'm invited to give memorial lectures like this one. I think it's all too easy to spout nice, pious verities, make people feel good, have a pleasant chat at the end of the evening, and wander off into the dark full of self-satisfaction. So if you're expecting something along those lines, please leave now. Because the purpose, I think, of a lecture like this is to try and make us think, reflect on the world in which we live, and try and make it better. There are a number of things I admire about Baxter, but what I admire most of all was that he had the courage to dissent. Dissent is what I want to talk to you about today. And it really seems to be an appropriate subject to discuss following the death on 18 September of United States Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who actually established her reputation before she went on the court as a lawyer for particular causes, and after she went on the court as a principled dissenter from what she saw as the unacceptable status quo. She was on the bench for 27 years. She was appointed by Bill Clinton in 1993. I think it was on a 96-3 vote in the Senate. Those were the good old days. And she was often ahead of her time. Public and political opinion eventually caught up with her views on a number of issues, and in the interim, she was often the subject of some vicious political attacks. But the other day I was reading David Farrer's Kiwi blog and saw that he'd posted a very nice obituary of Ruth Bader Ginsburg from the Federalist Society, which, as some of you may know, is the Society of Conservative Lawyers, and had as their patron saint, if you like, Justice Scalia. But Justice Scalia and Justice Ginsburg were apart on most issues and dissented quite a lot on the issues, but were very, very good friends, which proves a very important point, that just because you disagree with someone, you do not need to lack civility. And they both shared a love of opera, and they both were very good friends. And they were both, I suppose, dissenters. Of course, some dissenting judges are nothing more than egotistical gadflies, but I don't really want to talk about Justice Ted Thomas tonight. One can only really imagine the pressure that was placed on Baxter at the outset of the First World War. New Zealand's always been a closed society in many ways, even though at times we pride ourselves on our internationalism, our liberalism, and our outward-looking focus. In 1914, we were basically lackeys, if you like, of the United Kingdom, which along with the European powers rushed headlong into a crazy world war that basically scarred the rest of the century. And yet, when one thinks about it, its genesis was a fight between first cousins, with the Habsburgs thrown in for good measure. As a result of this exercise in gross stupidity, the Russian Empire fell, communism triumphed, and Russia was prevented from achieving its potential throughout the 20th century. The German Empire fell. We all know what happened after the Weimar Republic. The resulting chaos ushered in Nazism in 1933, and I obviously don't need to elaborate on that. The Austro-Hungarian Empire fell, was dismembered at the Treaty of Versailles thanks to President Woodrow Wilson. Austria followed Germany into Nazism in 1938, and the history of that magnificent part of the world, Middle Europa and Eastern Europe in the 20th century, was a tragedy. So many mistakes were made during the First World War, and those mistakes live with us today. As for the United Kingdom, it treated Canadians, Australians, and New Zealanders as colonials. As the minister primarily responsible for World War I commemorations at the time of the centenary a few years back, I visited Belgium and northern France on a couple of occasions. And what a sad, bitter experience it was to drive through the countryside and see war cemeteries every couple of kilometres. The saddest experience of all was visiting the cemetery at Passchendaele and seeing row upon row of war graves. Another sad experience was visiting Arras in northern France and going down into the caves where there were signs put up by young New Zealanders and actually young Cook Islanders pointing out how far away towns like New Plymouth were. Fine young people fought in vain, and too many of them had their lives snuffed out in the trenches of the Somme, Messines, Ypres, and other battlefields. Every day on Anzac Day, we remember what was the folly of Gallipoli, and we repeat a phrase. I did have in my notes the inane phrase. I should be a bit more respectful. The phrase, "They shall not grow old as we who are left grow old. Age shall not weary them." Well, of course they won't, because they all died in their early 20s as a result of the folly of people like Churchill, Lloyd George, Kitchener, and other guilty men. And some years ago, Peter Jackson had a magnificent exhibit in what was the old Dominion Museum building, now foolishly sold to Massey University. It should be a museum building. And as part of that exhibit, he had some photos that he'd colorized. And when you look at those photos of those young men brought to life through the brilliance of Peter Jackson's work, one sees how young they were, how fresh they were, and of course, they're the sorts of people who were our relatives who died too young. The atmosphere throughout this country was one of oppressive jingoism, and our mother country, loyalty to our mother country, meant we had to support the empire to defeat the Bosch, and demanded that we send thousands of young men and women overseas to fight in what was truly a meaningless war, the so-called war to end all wars. The atmosphere throughout the country was certainly one that could be called oppressive jingoism. And so I marvel at the courage that it took the likes of Baxter to refuse to participate in this conflict. For the average person, no doubt, he was a dissenter, even a traitor. He was certainly punished in the most grotesque manner. I don't need to go through that here. But in a small, closed country like New Zealand, Baxter's dissent, to me, is frankly almost unbelievable. 100 years on, and most of the people in this room look back at Baxter and the other conscientious objectors with admiration. They affirm his dissent, which is right and proper. But in the New Zealand of the 2020s, I wonder how many people would be prepared to take Baxter's stand, to go out on a limb and dissent from the majority opinion. Unfortunately, I don't think there are all that many who would. The events of this year would indicate to me that too many New Zealanders still subscribe to herd mentality, albeit in different circumstances. We're in the midst, we don't have to look around us to see that we are in the midst of the most awful pandemic, and the government has had to make some very difficult decisions about how to confront it. And I'm certainly not going to comment here on the approach taken by the government. Time, perhaps a royal commission, will tell whether or not the response taken here and in several states of Australia was the right response to save the most lives and preserve the economy. So I'm not going there. But whether it was due to panic, an inclination to submit to the instructions of the state, or some other aspect of our national psyche, in my opinion, there was a disturbing conformist trend which emerged among the New Zealand public as a whole this year. The first became apparent through the behaviour of the thousands of New Zealanders who reported neighbours to the authorities for perceived breaches of regulation. In late March and early April, the police website crashed several times due to the volume of people filing reports about people whose conduct they did not believe met the rules floating around at the time. Some of the reports were actually fair enough, large gatherings and the like, but many seemed to be for minor breaches or were completely incorrect. And a similar pattern occurred in our fellow liberal democracies, Australia and the United Kingdom, and the sheer volume of calls went beyond what I would have thought was warranted. As Lionel Shriver wrote about the British situation in The Spectator on 16 April 2020, the supine capitulation to a de facto police state in a country long regarded as a cradle of liberty has been one of the most depressing spectacles I've ever witnessed. In a matter of days, busybodies are ratting on neighbours for going for a run twice. These people would have been, quote, pigs and shit in communist East Germany. And it reminded me at times of that brilliant 2006 film, The Lives of Others, the story of the Stasi running riot in East Germany and the wonderful step taken by one person to rebel. But this tittle-tattle trend was really just part of a much more disturbing whole. In 2020, very few people are permitted to dissent from the majoritarian view on the government's response. Anyone who voices a contrary opinion is subject to withering attacks in various forms of social media and from a concerning new class of public figures, the medical expert, the politically aligned scientist. As for the media, with a few exceptions, everyone basically fell into line and repeated the government's message. But one brave soul did take a stand. His name was Andrew Borrowdale, a former lecturer in law at the University of Canterbury. Then he was a very talented parliamentary counsel, and he thought the lockdown was illegal and brought a case in the High Court. He was successful in obtaining a declaration about the first 9 days, even though the government said, even though the court said it understood why the lockdown was considered important by the government. He's now appealing the High Court ruling on the basis that despite his success, the judgment was too deferential to the executive. And I hope he has a good run in the Court of Appeal, because these are very important issues. And I note some very good recent commentary from academics like Andrew Geddes from this university, Claudia Geiringer, about whom I have said a few words a few minutes ago, and Janet McLean from the University of Auckland. We haven't heard the end of this matter. On the other hand, throughout the High Court case, I was disappointed at the number of commentators who thought that Borrowdale was nothing more than a legal pedant who was making unmeritorious points. Where were the commentators who should have been speaking on these matters? If the government of which I was a member had decreed a lockdown which was subsequently found to be unlawful, there would have been all hell to pay. And I can tell you now what Key would have done to me. I was Attorney General for 9 years, and knowing him, I would have been called into his office after that judgment was delivered and told that as Attorney General, I was there to ensure this sort of thing didn't happen, and I would have been fired. That was his modus operandi. The current Attorney General did a live stream 1-hour monologue on Facebook when questions about the legality of the first 9 days were raised, and he said he was satisfied as to its illegality, but he was wrong. New Zealanders didn't seem to mind that Police Commissioner Bush was telling his fellow citizens they'd be, quote, invited down to the police station for a little chat if they didn't conform. I heard of a number of instances where police stopped young people and totally inappropriately and wrongly and unfairly demanded to know what was in their bags. That was occurring in the first 9 days of lockdown. That kind of behaviour was oppressive and has no precedent outside wartime in this country, and even in wartime it was actually authorised by law. Here it wasn't. It shouldn't have been tolerated, but I regret to say that most of us simply fell into line. So 2020 has illustrated for me that we're not a nation of dissenters. By and large, we're a nation of conformists. Mrs. Thatcher once said that when people have the freedom to choose, they choose freedom. Well, I don't think they do. I think that's wrong. 2020, like so many other years in our history, is another year of compliance and conformity, deference by individual New Zealanders to the overwhelming power of the state. Even motorway road signs ordering us to be kind don't seem to arouse any concerns among the trusting, dependent New Zealand public. I've come to realise that those of us in whom those signs aroused Orwellian visions of the future are a very small minority. A few years ago, I was truly honoured to be the minister who gave the apology at Parihaka for the shocking events that occurred in Taranaki in 1881. It was one of the most amazing days of my life. It came as a result of a lot of work, because I don't know whether you know this, but the Crown had tried to apologise to Parihaka about 6 times and kept getting it wrong because they hadn't actually consulted with Parihaka about what the apology should contain. So a lot of work went into getting to the stage where the people of Parihaka were prepared to accept an apology. And it was truly an amazing opportunity to stand up and address wrongs that had been committed in the name of the Crown so many years ago. And it didn't go down all that well in some quarters. After I had apologised, and I was the first person ever to apologise for rape by soldiers of the Crown, I received a vicious letter the next week from someone who wanted chapter and verse and said I'd basically been lying. But everyone was greatly moved by the occasion. But go back to colonial New Zealand in the early 1880s, how many people actually did tolerate the dissent in Parihaka? People were detained without trial. In the late 1880s, habeas corpus was suspended. People were exiled to Otago, or you probably would think that's not too bad, or the Chathams. They were vilified for their stance. One or two people actually did dissent, that's fair. I was in the lobby many years ago of the House of Representatives preparing for the first reading debate. I was in opposition for the Ngāti Mutunga Claim Settlement Bill, and I was looking for the Hansard of the debate where habeas corpus had indeed been suspended. An elderly parliamentary messenger asked me what I was doing clambering up ladders in the lobby, and I told him. He was very knowledgeable about the actual event and about Parihaka, because his great-grandfather had been a soldier there. He told me the experience was so searing, so horrific, it turned his grandfather into a pacifist. But sadly, there were not many like him. It took great courage to dissent from the prevailing view that the Māori of Taranaki needed to be dealt to. A couple of decades after Parihaka, the Roman Catholic bishop, he was then, died an Archbishop of Auckland, Bishop Liston, spoke in the Auckland Town Hall about the treatment of the Irish at the hands of the British, and he was tried for sedition. Most people blame Massey for the prosecution, a convenient bogey boy, but in actual fact, the prosecution, which was conducted by Sir Vincent Meredith of the firm of what is now Meredith Connell, was conducted because of pressure from the New Zealand Herald. Again, the prevailing view of the majority was that the UK needed to deal to the Irish rabble, and dissent from that view was not tolerated. Luckily, sedition was abolished in New Zealand in 2007. It's no longer a crime in New Zealand in 2020, thank God for that. Some people doubtless say that though this may have been the case in the old days, we're far more liberal in questioning than we were, but I think that all depends on an individual's point of view on a particular topic. Yes, there was dissent over such matters as rugby contacts with South Africa and nuclear ships, but I fear they are the exception rather than the rule. Take climate change, for example. I believe it's real. I believe it has to be confronted, but there are people who don't. Can anyone seriously suggest that dissent on that topic is tolerated? Indeed, the editor of Stuff has apparently decreed that articles questioning the validity of the ever-changing scientific consensus on the causes of climate change will not be accepted. I find that an odd proposition. Surely it's better to engage in the debate with the same ferocity as your opponents rather than try and shut them down. Win the argument, don't silence your opponent, and better still, if you think your opponent's completely off the wall, give them airtime. Another example would be the debate a few years ago about marriage equality. It was actually very difficult to voice any arguments against the legislation. I opposed it on the ground that the state should not be involved in marriage at all. Civil unionise everyone, I say, so long as I'm not involved. Marriage should be privatised, as it was for hundreds of years in England and Wales until the 19th century. I thought the time was ripe for a principled debate about the laws governing relationships to determine what was the appropriate role of the state in a secular age, but that was decried as legalistic. So the history of this country shows that we can be, at times, oppressively conformist, and if people step out of line, they are looked at with suspicion, are often ostracised and silenced, and in the case of conscientious objectors, were crushed, but of course that failed. They tried to crush them and they couldn't. That's why people like Baxter are real heroes. They stood against the prevailing views of the day and never surrendered. Neither did the people of Parihaka, but they paid a terrible price. So I think the challenge for all of us is to live lives worthy of Archibald Baxter. Never uncritically accept anything as the given truth, regardless of the issue of the day or its political popularity. That doesn't mean to say that dissent should be never-ending. It's a well-known maxim of the law that it's in the public interest that there be an end to litigation. And so too, I can understand that sentiment applying to many of the arguments that have bedeviled the society in the past. There does come a time when argument on a topic should stop, when the consensus view should prevail. And I guess John Key would agree with this. Nuclear ships is one such example. Another example would be that no one in their right mind could ever sensibly argue the case for recriminalisation of homosexuality. One would hope that it was generally accepted throughout society, regardless of whether people are liberal or conservative, that the treatment of homosexuals throughout history has been grotesque and unfair, and all people, regardless of sexual orientation, should be treated with dignity, and that there are matters of private morality and public morality, and the state has no right to involve itself in private morality. Certainly that is one would expect in a Western democratic society such as ours, and one would hope it would soon become the prevailing view in all parts of the world. But in the end, the vast majority of public policy issues should lend themselves to debate and to dissent. We've seen plenty of these issues in recent years. For me, Brexit was a good one. Brexit taught me many things. One of them is, as Boris Johnson shows, it's possible for a politician to lie and get away with it. But one person who stood up against that particular stance was a friend of mine, Dominic Grieve, who had been made Attorney General when David Cameron became Prime Minister in 2010, and he was fired in 2014 because I think he gave legal advice rather than politically acceptable legal advice. He took a stance against Brexit, fell out with his own party, ended up being deselected as the Conservative MP for Beaconsfield, and lost his seat in last year's general election, but proving the principle that it takes a lot of courage to stand up to your enemies. It takes even more courage to stand up to your friends. And Dominic took a stance and fell out with his leader, who had been tremendously disloyal throughout the May years, but enforced with almost Stalinist zealotry the idea that you could not disagree with him once he became Prime Minister. So Dominic did not allow his own self-interest to force him to fall into line so that he could remain MP for Beaconsfield. He did not uncritically accept as gospel a particular policy prescription. People must, in public life and in private life, continue to do what people like Dominic Grieve did, dissent, even if it makes you unpopular, even if ultimately it destroys you. So as Baxter shows, it takes courage to dissent, particularly in a conformist country like ours. But the message of Baxter and the other conscientious objectors is that dissent is not only a good thing, a moral thing, a wholesome thing, but is essential in any society. And that's why I am truly honoured to be a member of this trust, which was established to honour the memory of conscientious objectors who saw that the Great War was evil and folly, and that they would not participate in it. They were punished, they were treated badly, they were vilified for years after, but history has shown they were right. They saw wrong, and they didn't tolerate it. Their memory must be honoured. Their example must be followed, regardless of the issue. They were heroes in a time of madness. They are heroes now, and I hope I honour them with the speech tonight.
Thanks very much, Chris. There are many, many issues there that are kind of put on the table in a very elegant way. But I want to call now on Paul Sorrell to again give a vote of thanks.
Thank you, Stephen. I think we should stand over here again, because for the convenience of the camera. I just wanted to say what a delight it was to meet Christopher today. He's been a trustee since last year, but I met him for the first time today when all the trustees had lunch together at a local cafe, and Chris regaled us with anecdotes about some of our more colourful politicians, and he never once verged on the indiscreet. So that was fine. And the lecture today I found wonderful. The thing that I really loved about it was that it broke open these categories of liberal and conservative. And it certainly did that for me. And I was in some turbulence as one or two of those issues were discussed, especially the response to COVID-19, and wanted to jump up and put the opposing point of view. And this is not the kind of treatment we're often subjected to in the Baxter lecture. And I think that the stimulation we've derived has been evident in the number of questions. Normally we don't get half the number of questions that have been asked in the lecture today. So it's been a wonderful time, and you've really sort of broken open this division. I was reflecting that unless we can do that with ourselves, we're in danger of giving ourselves over to a kind of iron-cast ideology that we never question. So it's very important to do that. And so I would like to offer this little gift in thanks, and I'd invite everybody to give a vote of thanks.